By the time the transport finally stopped, no one outside the chain of custody knew exactly where the men were, how long they had been restrained, or what condition they were in. The paperwork would later show a routine transfer. The reality was quieter, harder to verify, and far more consequential. That uncertainty has followed inmate transports connected to Pelican Bay State Prison for decades. Long before most people ever heard the phrase supermax, the movement of prisoners to and from this facility had already developed a reputation of its own. Not because of a single scandal or a dramatic failure, but because of how deliberately little was explained, how many steps were shielded from public view, and how difficult it became to reconstruct what actually happened once the doors closed. Pelican Bay State Prison sits in Del Norte County, California, near the Oregon border, one of the most isolated locations in the state's correctional system. It opened in 1989, designed explicitly to house inmates classified as the most dangerous or disruptive within California prisons. Over time, it became synonymous with long-term isolation and extreme control. But less attention has been paid to what happens before an inmate ever arrives there, or what happens when they leave. The first major reveal is this: for many prisoners, the transport itself became an extension of punishment, not merely a logistical step. Court records, internal policy reviews, and prisoner testimony describe a system where movement was tightly controlled, minimally documented in public-facing records, and deliberately opaque. This was not accidental. It was part of a broader philosophy that treated transport as a security operation rather than a human process. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper. California's Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, known as CDCR, has long maintained that transport procedures exist to ensure safety. That includes the safety of staff, the public, and the inmate being moved. On paper, the protocols are standardized, restraints are applied, medical clearance is required, logs are kept, and vehicles are staffed by trained officers. But Pelican Bay transfers were different in practice, because the inmates involved were classified differently. Many of those sent to Pelican Bay were validated as gang members or associates, placed in security housing units, or labeled as management problems at other institutions. That classification followed them into transport decisions. Restraints were often heavier. Movement schedules were less predictable. Routes were longer, sometimes deliberately indirect, to avoid contact with the public or other inmates. What followed raised a question that still hasn't been fully answered: how much oversight actually existed once a transport left prison grounds? Unlike courtroom proceedings or in-prison disciplinary hearings, inmate transport operates largely outside public scrutiny. Vehicles are not tracked publicly. Stops are not disclosed. Officers are not required to provide real-time reporting. For Pelican Bay transfers, this lack of visibility was compounded by geography. The prison's remoteness meant trips often lasted many hours, sometimes more than a day, depending on origin. Former inmates have described being shackled at the wrists, waist, and ankles for the entire duration. Some reported minimal access to water or restrooms. Others described being transported in extreme temperatures. These accounts appear repeatedly in civil rights lawsuits filed in California federal courts. While not every claim was upheld, enough survived initial review to establish a pattern worth examining. But that wasn't the worst part. The more troubling issue emerged when medical consequences began appearing after transport. In several documented cases, inmates arrived at Pelican Bay or another facility with injuries that were not recorded at the point of departure. Bruising, nerve damage, dehydration, and in rare cases, loss of consciousness were reported. Investigations often stalled at a familiar barrier: insufficient documentation. Transport logs typically recorded departure time, arrival time, and staff involved. They did not always record rest stops, adjustments to restraints, or complaints made during transit. When allegations surfaced, the lack of detail made it difficult to determine responsibility. That ambiguity protected staff from individual accountability while leaving inmates with little recourse. CDCR has repeatedly denied that transport protocols were used punitively. Official responses emphasized that restraints and procedures were based on classification and risk assessment, not retaliation. But internal memos obtained through public records requests tell a more complicated story. They reveal ongoing debates within the department about how much force was necessary, how long restraints should remain in place, and whether certain practices increased legal exposure. One internal review acknowledged that prolonged restraint during long-distance transport could create heightened risk of medical distress, particularly for inmates with pre-existing conditions. The review recommended additional training and clearer documentation. What it did not do was fundamentally change the secrecy surrounding transport operations. Few people outside ever learned what happened next. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Pelican Bay became a focal point for broader criticism of California's use of isolation and control. Lawsuits challenging indefinite solitary confinement brought increased scrutiny to the prison. Transport practices were not the central issue in those cases, but they surfaced repeatedly in testimony and filings. Attorneys representing inmates argued that harsh transport conditions discouraged prisoners from exercising legal rights. Missed court appearances, delayed medical appointments, and psychological stress associated with movement all appeared in legal records. In some instances, inmates declined to attend hearings rather than endure another transfer. That consequence was rarely acknowledged publicly, but it had real effects on access to justice. CDCR responded by pointing to policy manuals and training programs. Officials stated that officers were instructed to monitor inmates for distress, provide water and bathroom access, and respond to medical emergencies. Yet disciplinary records show that violations were rarely substantiated. When complaints were filed, they were often investigated by the same department responsible for the transport. This created a contradiction that remains unresolved. On one hand, the system claimed rigorous safeguards. On the other, it produced very little verifiable data to prove those safeguards were consistently applied. By the time reforms began to be discussed seriously, much of the damage was already done. In 2011, a series of hunger strikes originating at Pelican Bay drew international attention. The strikes focused primarily on conditions inside the security housing unit, but transport issues surfaced again as participants described being moved under restrictive conditions as retaliation or deterrence. Independent observers were unable to verify many of these claims, but the volume and consistency of reports forced CDCR to respond. Subsequent policy updates clarified maximum restraint times and emphasized the need for medical checks during transport. Oversight mechanisms were expanded slightly, including increased involvement of medical staff in pre-transport clearance. Still, the core structure remained intact. Transport operations continued to be treated as a security matter, not a transparency issue. That raises another question: why does secrecy persist even after reform? Part of the answer lies in institutional culture. Correctional systems are built around risk minimization. Any disclosure that could be interpreted as revealing procedures is viewed as a potential security threat. This mindset makes transparency difficult, even when transparency might prevent harm. Another factor is legal insulation. As long as policies exist on paper, departments can argue compliance, even if implementation varies. Without independent monitoring, deviations are hard to prove. For Pelican Bay transfers, the absence of external oversight has been a constant. The human impact, however, is easier to trace. Former inmates have described transport as one of the most disorienting aspects of incarceration. Unlike life inside a facility, where routines eventually form, transport is unpredictable. The loss of sensory cues, combined with restraints and isolation, can trigger panic or dissociation. Mental health professionals have noted that these effects are intensified for individuals already subjected to long-term isolation. Yet transport rarely appears in public discussions of prison reform. It is treated as a minor detail, a necessary inconvenience. That framing ignores how power operates in moments when oversight disappears entirely. What followed shocked even experienced observers. In a small number of cases, transport-related deaths occurred elsewhere in the United States, prompting national conversations about restraint practices. While Pelican Bay was not directly linked to those fatalities, the cases influenced policy debates in California. They underscored how quickly routine procedures can become fatal when safeguards fail. California responded by revising restraint policies statewide. The changes reduced the use of certain restraint positions and emphasized continuous monitoring. But again, implementation depended on internal enforcement. The transport environment remained largely invisible to the public. As of today, Pelican Bay State Prison continues to operate, and inmate transfers continue under updated protocols. The secrecy has not vanished. What has changed is awareness. Researchers, journalists, and advocates now understand that movement itself can be a site of harm. That understanding leads to a final unresolved issue. If transport protocols are truly about safety, why is independent verification still so limited? Why are medical logs not standardized across facilities? Why are stops, restraint adjustments, and complaints still inconsistently recorded? These questions do not accuse. They observe. They emerge from decades of records, lawsuits, and internal reviews. And they remain unanswered not because they are unimportant, but because they challenge a system built on controlled silence. Pelican Bay's reputation was forged inside its walls. But part of its legacy exists on the road, in the unmarked hours between prisons, where accountability becomes harder to trace and consequences are easier to deny. Those journeys rarely make headlines. They leave behind few witnesses and fewer records. But for the people who lived through them, they were not just transfers. They were experiences that shaped how power was felt, how rights were constrained, and how easily suffering could be hidden in plain sight. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.